Hello, friends. Nice to see you. Thank you for joining for this session on measuring and improving diversity, equity, inclusion in schools. Um, I am going to talk you through a few of the things that we use in Being Luminary to support schools in measuring their diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. And I am going to also share some resources with you so that you can get on measuring your own DEI initiatives in your organization. I am just trying to make sure that I have everything that I need for this session in place, but really good to see you. Lovely to have so many signups for this session. I know lots of people couldn't make it to the session live, but we'll send out the recording to anyone who registered for the session, and we will also send out all of the resources. So I'll share some resources in the chat, but I'm also going to send out the resources in addition. So I'm very much hoping that when I share these in the chat, you are going to be able to access this folder. She's got a few documents in it that we're going to come to in a moment, so you don't need to look at them just this second, although you are welcome to. This is what I want to cover today. So a bit of a step-by-step guide to implementing your own DEI evaluation process. And then I'm just going to talk briefly about how some of the schools that are currently involved in our Excellence in Equity award scheme are using it to create change in the different environments that they're in. So they're all of our schools on the award are in very different contexts, and I just want to kind of demonstrate to you really how that's working out for them. And as I say, I want to give you some practical tools that will hopefully help you to translate some of the insights that you already have about the quality of DEI initiatives in your school into further improvements. And what I do want to say is, I know people say this all the time when they're doing when they're doing workshops and they're doing webinars, they say, please stay in touch, please get in touch and let us know how it's going. But I really, really mean it. So what I like to understand is how our tools are out there working in the world for people, regardless of whether you're signed up for any of our programs. So please do make sure that you stay in touch with us and let us know how those things are going. Okay, I wanted to start off by just kind of being clear really on why I think we need to be measuring our DEI initiatives. I see often that schools are, and having been a head teacher, I see often and know often that schools are very reactive places, which means that there are often inciting incidents that happen out there in the world, and they force the attention of the schools on them. And they force the attention because young people start demanding that something change in the school as a consequence of those inciting incidents that have happened outside, or because parents start wanting to have deeper conversations with schools about what you're actually doing as a consequence of that inciting incident that's happened outside there in the world. Or we have staff in our schools who are saying, actually, this thing that has happened out in the world, I feel is mirrored within the context of our own school. And so I feel like we need to do something about it. And we saw that after the murder of George Floyd. Many people are engaged in the work that we do at Being Luminary as a consequence of everything that occurred when George Floyd was murdered and just after, in that year following George Floyd's murder. But similarly, there have been inciting incidents like those that led to the Me Too movement, those that led to the Everyone's Invited movement. There are currently there are geopolitical there's war happening right now, and we know that those are things that then find their way into schools. And what schools tend to do is to react to those things, but react in a way that is quite chaotic and lacks cohesion, typically lacks strategic planning. And of course, it lacks strategic planning because we're trying to deal with events as they are occurring. And so what we find is that the initial burst of activity is often followed by a return to business as usual. And business as usual in schools is actually an attempt to be calm and to be still, and probably not to engage in a lot of action that is outside of the norm. Actually, schools are quite well placed to tolerate different and new initiatives. And so business as usual can often look like some form of what we describe as systemic inertia. and competing priorities, business as usual, the business of a school, tends to derail those initial DEI initiatives that were started as a consequence of those outside inciting incidences. And so as a result, we see that schools begin to typify diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives as being things that are in reaction to, rather than become business as usual. They address those incidents, but tend not to really get into the root causes. And they end up with this kind of hodgepodge of different things happening in a school. Often I go to a school and I say, tell me everything that's happening around DEI. And people are able to really give me a kind of smorgasbord of different things that they're up to, different activities that they're up to, but they're often disconnected. And so it's really difficult to work out whether or not they're going to yield any change. And I think embedded in there is something that we need to be really watchful of when we're interested in equity. I think embedded in the idea, in the psychology of DEI just being this random series of activities that we do, is the sense that we can constantly resist change, that we're actually kind of upholding this non-changing state of institutions. The other thing, of course, that happens when we have a scattergun approach to DEI work and we have a bunch of initiatives, that it's really difficult to retain momentum. And so we end up with a kind of superficial engagement, and it's really difficult to see any deep cultural shifts taking place. And so we end up perpetuating inequity rather than addressing anything meaningfully. And we really miss the opportunity to change our organization. This quote is from Fast Company, which is why it talks to company culture. But certainly what we see in schools is mirrored by everything that is being documented, that is happening around diversity, equity, inclusion work in the corporate sector as well. And so our work in this sort of beginning to try to codify what good and even luminary equity practice looks like arises partly out of this frustration that I have as somebody that's a big picture thinker with these fragmented efforts. I mean, I find it a little bit irritating. You can see from my body language, but it also arises as a consequence of the conversations that we were having with school leaders right back at the beginning of being luminary in 2019. And so we went out there with a program. It was called the Being Luminary program. It still is called the Being Luminary program. And I would start the program, and we would start our training focused on a range of protected characteristics. And I would say to leaders, tell me about your DEI work. Tell me about your DEI work as that pertains to the group of people we're talking about today. So in any given session, we would be focused on individuals in the organization who held a particular protected characteristic. And so I would say, tell me about the experience of people who identify as being pregnant, on maternity leave, or parents in your organization. And people would say, well, I don't know if we really know about that. And I would say, well, tell me about their experiences as they meet the policies of your school, or tell me what policies you have in place. Well, I think we kind of have a policy that is their experience documented in this? So there was a lot of questions and not many answers. And I felt like I was asking some pretty fundamental questions about school culture. And actually it ended up with people feeling a bit like they were being put on the spot. So I tried to think of a way in which we could get school leaders to be better prepared for our Being Luminary program. And in doing that, it really became very clear to me that school leaders, and I include myself in this, haven't actually been very well prepared to think strategically about diversity, equity, inclusion. It's like there's a bug in the system somewhere. So I hadn't had any training about how to strategize diversity, equity, inclusion when I was coming up through school leadership. And there was no reason that anyone else should have had that training. And so as a consequence, as I say, we've kind of taken for granted that DEI initiatives were designed to be scattered and fragmented and to lose momentum over time. And so what we decided to do at Being Luminary was put together something that would put an end to that would be a really clear roadmap through what equity maturity looked like. We recognized that there was a sort of early stage of equity maturity, and there would be some later stages of equity maturity. And in those later stages, and in identifying what it looked like to get to those later stages, we were effectively putting together a roadmap. a roadmap that would support people at every stage of the journey. And so our Excellence in Equity Award, which was formerly known as the DEI Maturity Evaluation, I mean formerly as in before yesterday was known as the DEI Maturity Evaluation, grew out of this need to support schools to be able to answer the question, tell me about what can you tell me about your DEI work? And what I wanted was for people to recognize that DEI work touches on all aspects of school life in the same way that safeguarding does, and that there were really easy ways to measure it. And so what we've done is we have put together a framework that supports schools in measuring their progress towards DEI maturity, and it also allows them the opportunity to apply for an award. So what I want to talk to you about today is that roadmap, because I want to share with you, regardless of whether you're on any of our programs, really the ease with which most of you could go about codifying what it is you're doing and plotting your position on a map. I'm not going to share the entirety of the DEI maturity evaluation because it would take quite some time. And we do this work with schools over the course of a full year, but I am going to share the early stages of our criteria, and I've shared those in the folder that I have just popped into the chat, and I'm going to talk a bit about them, and then I'm going to give you an exercise to do so that we can begin to see where your schools might be in relation to some of those areas. So let's talk a bit about the criteria, and please take this away with you. Use it as you will. I'm really happy for our work to be used. Just do reference us if you do take it away and use it. So I'm an English teacher, which means that it was impossible for me to come up with a grading criteria that was simply 1 to 5. It offended me, quite frankly, the idea of it. So we came up with a criteria that is a little more lyrical. So our criteria goes from dusking through to luminary, as you would expect. The dusking phase are the nascent stages of our criteria, the early stages of DEI maturity. And we go through dusking, dawning, glimmering, brightening, and luminary. And what we've done is we've tied our award scheme, our excellence in award scheme, to the later stages of this criteria. So if schools are able to demonstrate that they can meet the criteria at glimmering across all sections of the evaluation, then we will award a bronze award, and when they get to brightening, a silver award, and when they get to luminary, a gold award. And our view is very much that diversity, equity, inclusion work is, of course, not a binary. It is a journey. And there is, like every other aspect of school life, the opportunity to improve as we go along this journey. And so what we would see at each stage of the criteria sounds a little like this. And this is me gathering together the criteria against the various pillars of school life, which I'll go into in a moment. But at the dusking stage, the very early stage, what we're really trying to say is that and the dusking stage tends to capture where the majority of schools we met, certainly in 2021, 22, and I would say even 2023, that's where they were. They were in this dusking stage, and that is to say that they were in the nascent stages of a journey, but they were probably doing things that we will ultimately want to see dusk. So this is not me saying that at the early stage, we're necessarily seeing good practice. We are likely seeing practice that is typically compliant, but is not necessarily yet good. And so what we're really wanting is for schools to recognize that dusking is the stage that we quite urgently need to move beyond. In the dusking stage, the early phase, organizations are typically building the foundational awareness of equity in their organizations and what that will look like. Policies tend to meet very basic requirements, so they will be compliant. We look at a whole host of different pillars of school life, and what we would see is that physical spaces will be accessible, but there will be minimal accessibility features in them. Digital platforms will adhere to some basic standards, but we're looking for accessibility and representation in those digital platforms, and that will be at the very early level. And staff training will cover some DEI fundamentals. So we're probably seeing things like some unconscious bias training, perhaps some work around anti-racism has taken place, but we're seeing fragmented offers in this professional learning portfolio, and then the curriculum showing limited representation. And culture, we measure through stakeholder feedback, and what we're seeing in this dusking stage is stakeholders reporting feeling quite unsure about how to raise concerns, whether those concerns will be taken seriously, and parents and students noticing the gap between the stated commitments, the rhetoric of an organisation, and the actual practice that's taking place. By the time we get to the dawning stage, we're seeing the organisation move from that early awareness to taking action. And those actions may be tentative at first. We're seeing clear DEI policies beginning to emerge. What's interesting is I spend a lot of time on school websites. Many of you don't know this, but I lurk around the websites of different schools and I have a look at what they are saying about diversity, equity, inclusion. And I notice that very few are articulating their own sentiments around DEI. We're still locked into compliance. We're locked into the copying and pasting of standard policies that have been taken from government websites or local authority websites with the school name pasted onto them. What we're beginning to see when we get to the dawning phase is that DEI policies begin to be recognized as a suite of policies, not just a single equality of opportunity policy. Physical and digital spaces start reflecting the diverse needs that our school communities have, and staff begin to engage in some more structured DEI training. And the curriculum begins to incorporate many more diverse perspectives, and though that might not yet be systematic. And so we might have the odd department that is really committed to this work, not yet this sort of expectation that this work in the curriculum is happening across the school. What we start to see at this phase is students from a variety of backgrounds participating more in a variety of activities. We look at both the taught curriculum, but also the co and extracurricular. And staff and parents will report in our culture surveys that communication around equity issues is improving. By the time we get to the glimmering stage, this is where we award our Bronze Award, we're seeing the work become strategic. And this strategic integration of equity is evident through the wider strategic plans of the organisation. Policies are actively supporting inclusion. Remembering that when I talk about policies, I'm talking about every policy of the school. So in the same way that every policy in the school will make a nod towards things like safeguarding, my expectation is that every policy in the school makes a nod towards equity. It's kind of underpinning everything that we do. And we start to see that spaces have been more deliberately designed for accessibility. That's really thoughtful. People feel that care. That digital platforms are starting to prioritize the diverse user needs that there will be across any school community. Staff are beginning to receive more comprehensive DEI training, and this is reflected in the quality of the curriculum, which is now able to more regularly reflect diverse perspectives and the experiences of the diverse school community that you all have. And students begin to report through our culture surveys that they feel more included. Staff are engaging more confidently with DEI practices, that evidence that people are able to challenge the use of the N word on the playground. They are able to stop a conversation in its tracks that suggests that there is, gender-based violence underneath it. They're able to halt what's happening in conversation because they feel confident in their DEI IQ, as we call it. And parents begin to notice consistent improvement in addressing concerns. And although I haven't shared this bit with you in these slides, I'm just going to give you a nod towards brightening, where we start to see DEI really becoming embedded in the daily operations of a school. And this bit on policies is very important to me. When we get to brightening, we start to see policies that are not just not just neutral, they are actively beneficial. And so policies that are neutral do the right thing, they're ethical. Policies that are beneficial, that are proactive, do more than the right thing. They actually say, this circumstance in the world is one that we find intolerable, and we have the ability to interrupt it in our organization. So an organization that is doing something like adopting the HALO code is recognizing that it has the opportunity to interrupt the systemic racism that is evident in many school uniform policies that actually act against those people who have, for example, who have Afro hair. So there's an example of a kind of policy that proactively champions inclusion. Physical and digital environments begin to celebrate diversity. Staff development deeply engages with of different backgrounds. And parents here are reporting satisfaction with the school's approach to inclusion. So this is a big milestone that we have at this point. And then finally, when we get to Luminary, the ever movable goal of Luminary, we start to see schools really being shaped by equity across all dimensions of school life. Policies set a new standard. At Luminary, we're expecting schools to be exemplifying inclusive design across a whole range of different pillars of school life. So across your digital environment, your physical environment, of course, your curriculum. And in terms of professional learning, this is where we start to see organizations supporting each other and in order to really kind of champion this work across a network of schools. So I've shared this criteria with you in the chat, in the folder that I've given you, and it's worth thinking already beginning to think about where your schools might be in relation to those first 3 stages and in relation to these 5 pillars of school life. So these are the pillars that we recommend that schools use to assess the effectiveness of their diversity, equity, inclusion work. And so what we would say is that there are many other pillars of school life that you can include, but these, for me, certainly feel like the ones that we can really engage with in order to get a good sense of what is going on in our school. So the pillars are policy, digital environment, physical environment, professional learning, curriculum, and culture. And I just want to go through them a little, just to kind of explore with you how these operate. So policy we see as the cornerstone of a school's formal commitment to DEI, and policy will encompass all of your official documents, all of your procedures. And really this pillar examines or helps us examine how thoroughly equity inclusion is also woven into things like governance. So the task for you is to begin to think about whether or not your policies are at the dusking, the dawning, or perhaps the glimmering, perhaps you think you're above that stage, whether or not there is this kind of sense that you have considered accessibility across all of your policies, but also those policies are really effectively understood by all of your stakeholders. The next pillar is physical environment, and the physical environment, of course, it takes account of all of the tangible spaces where learning and interaction occur for young people. And this pillar evaluates the schools, how the effectiveness of the school's physical spaces, how they welcome, how they represent, and how they accommodate all members of the school community. So with both physical environment and digital environment, we're actually looking at accessibility and representation in displays, in artwork, the availability of appropriate facilities for all people, whether those are breastfeeding rooms, prayer spaces, whether they are environments in which we have hearing induction loops, whether they are environments that have been sensitively constructed for people to maneuver around them when they are wheelchair users. So it's wheelchair users. So it's everything from reception areas to classrooms, to social spaces, to specialist environments within your school. The digital environment, like the physical environment, also asks you to think about representation and accessibility. So if you take nothing else away from this, please hear me when I say accessibility is one layer, but representation is the other, with which we need to really address our physical and digital environments. And the school's virtual presence, the digital presence, is really, really critical. Everything that is said about you through the imagery that you choose for your LinkedIn pages, for your Instagram pages, the way that your Facebook page presents itself to the world, as well as the particular learning platforms and communication systems that you use. This pillar assesses accessibility and representation across all of your digital content. The next the next pillar is professional learning. and professional learning is pretty obvious. It's the effectiveness of your of the way in which you equip your school workforce to create inclusive environments, and the way in which you support everybody across the organization in their ability to address bias and support learners. Curriculum, again, pretty self-explanatory. The content on and delivery and assessment of learning experiences in the extra and talk curriculum. And then culture is the final pillar, which we assess through three stakeholder surveys. And if you were going to do this in your own school, I would say do speak to these three stakeholder groups individually. Those are staff, your students, and your parents. And the order in which I always recommend schools do this is to speak to staff first, and then to pause to listen to what staff have said, then to do a student survey or have student conversation or forum, and then finally to follow up with parents. So those are the pillars of school life. And what I want to do now is to move into something a little bit more interactive, so you can still listen to me, but have a little exercise for you to do. So what I'd like you to bring up in the Google Drive that I have shared with you are is the set of criteria that I shared with you. So there are 3 documents in there. One is called Dawning, one is called Dusking, and one is called Glimmering. And those 3 individual documents contain bullet point lists, unlike the narrative ones. So the dawning stage has got about 15 bullet points of the sorts of things that we expect to see at the dawning stage. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to, we're going to start off just thinking about policy. So as part of the Excellence in Equity Award, we consider your entire suite of policies. Oh, somebody says the chat has been disabled. Well, that's not very good, is it? Okay, bear with me while I try to enable the chat. And if I can't do this, then I will go through these questions with you, and I will send you the criteria for each of these in a moment. Let me see if I am able to put this into some kind of format. Okay, let me see if I can do this in here. Can you see it now in the QA? Maybe somebody give me a thumbs up if you can see that in the QA. Great, fab. Okay, thanks, Scotty. Great. So if you hit that link, you will now see, you were very polite. You didn't even mention it when I've said it 3 times. I've shared this with you. You're very polite. So if you click on that link, you should now have access to a Google folder, and you should be able to see that dawning, dusking, dawning, glimmering PDFs. And so what I would like to do, so we're going back to this task, is to give you a bit of a policy task. And obviously for these, we don't have very much time because it's only a 45-minute webinar, but you can take this away with you and have a good go at it. But it would be lovely to have your responses actually in the QA, because for some reason I've disabled the chat. But I will endeavour to ensure that the next time I do one of these, I don't disable the chat. So in the Excellence in Equity Award, we look, as I've said, at all of your policies. So we invite schools to think about policy as a very broad area of school life. And of course, we're interested in DEI policies, but we're also interested in your behaviour policy, and because I think your behaviour policy is an equity policy, and we're interested in your exclusions policy, and we're interested in your uniform policy, and we're interested in, I mean, all of the policies really. So that being said, there is still an opportunity to look at some of the core policies through the lens of the criteria that I've just been sharing with you. And you can, take this away and think about it in a bit more detail. But what's your gut instinct if you were to review your DEI policy statement, the one that you currently have on your own school website, and you were to review your accessibility plan, the one that you should have published on your website too, and you were to review your equality of opportunity statement, that's the one I find most schools have got published on their website, and it tends to be a staff-facing policy, so it tends to be owned by the HR team. That's always my tell, is who owns this policy. If it's the HR team, then it tends to be about staff terms of paying conditions and things like that, and their terms of service. If it's owned by some other person, like an education, or it's been updated with a kind of pastoral lens, then I start to feel like, oh, this could be really interesting. So if you're to read the criteria, that dawning, I know I've given you kind of generic dusking, dawning, glimmering criteria, and then you were to think about those 3 documents, policy documents, what's your snap judgment on what stage of the criteria you would come in at? Do you think that you're already a glimmering school? Do you think you're beyond? Do you think, actually, Angie, we've attended to our entire policy suite and it's a luminary because we reference equity in all of the policies that we do? We have a carefully well-constructed, co-collaborated on DEI statement. If you were to look at our website, you would very easily find the DEI pages of our site. Anyone, you don't have to be a scientist in websites, would be able to access that information. Or are you kind of feeling like, actually, I think we're at the early stages. I think we've got to cut and paste equality of opportunity statement from the local authority or from our trust, and we haven't really done much to amend that. If you feel confident to share your responses in the QA with me, I would love to know. Where you think you are. And I'm just going to offer that if you come to this exercise, and hopefully you will come to this exercise again after the session, and you go back through the session and do it with a little less haste, then please do drop me a line afterwards and just let me know what you discover about your policies. Sandra, I didn't quite understand what you were saying there. Is it good? Is it yippee? Okay, I'm going to move on to the next one. So digital environment, similar exercise for you here. So when we do this within our Excellence and Equity Award, we obviously consider representation of folks who have a range of different characteristics of identity. But let's start really, really small. I would like you to review your homepage, and I would like you to review your vision and values page as well. So often when I look at school websites, they have a homepage, and then they might have an About Us tab, or the homepage might be the About Us tab, but they might have a welcome page that's separate, and that, or they might have a vision and values page which is separate. Looking for those kinds of things, you're sort of about the first page that people will see, and then the bit that maybe goes into a bit more detail about your organization. So what do those 2 pages say when you review those? Make a snap judgment about accessibility and representation on those pages of your site, if at all possible. What's your snap judgment in terms of the criteria about those 2 pages of your site? And do feel free to put something into the chat. Ooh, I'm nearly glimmering. Fantastic. That's quite fantastic. And is that, and that might be in relation to both. Any other thoughts on where you are in relation to digital environment or policy? The next invitation I have with you is to consider the physical environment. So as part of our Excellence in Equity Award, we consider representation and accessibility across the whole school. But again, thinking small for the purposes of today's session, just think about the reception of your school, the reception area of your school, and think about one other public facing area of your school. So I like things like car parks are quite good, because somehow we never really quite conceive of them as being part of our physical environment. And often they're really badly signposted, and they're really inaccessible for people who are wheelchair users often as well. The main car park of the school that people are expected to use. Sometimes I visit schools and I don't even really know where I'm supposed to go. So think about reception and think about as in the reception of the school, not the reception phase of your school. Think about the reception of your school and the public facing area, one other public facing area of your school. And again, take a snap judgment about representation of folks who hold protected characteristics. So what would people see? Would they see themselves or their children represented in your in the school, in the kind of in any of those public facing spaces, or in the reception? Would we see diversity of family? Would we see diversity of faith? What would we see? And where do you think your school sits in that dusking through to glimmering stage? Yeah, somebody here saying physical environment is old, listed building and accessibility is lacking. Certainly been in that environment. I've also had a school in a listed building, and it's a real challenge. But representation isn't a challenge in that. And so where are there opportunities to really think about representation as much as you are thinking about accessibility? And what can you do that is about inclusive design, nevertheless, within a grade 2 listed or a grade 2 star listed building even? What can you do to ensure inclusive design is at the forefront of your thinking? Okay, Sandra, not good. Okay. And another one for you here, curriculum. So we consider the co, extra and core curriculum across the entire school. But again, let's start small. Think about one curriculum area. I'm an English teacher, so I would always think about the English department, and then have a look at the criteria, make a snap judgment about representation of folks who hold protected characteristics in this area of the curriculum. So what have we got when we think about representation? Who do we see? Who sees themselves in your curriculum? And I don't just mean we've got some books in the library, or we've changed the books in the library, because the curriculum is much more than that. It's about the way that the curriculum is assessed. It's the way that it's taught. It's about the lens through which the people teaching it really understand representation also. But also if I then go into, from my lesson, and I go outside into another into I don't know, my hockey game after school or something, do I then see a much more one-dimensional vision of representation? So what's happening there? And feel free again to put some things in the chat or in the QA. And then the final area, because I don't have time to talk about culture today, but happy to do another of these webinars if this is helpful. The final area is professional learning. So we consider professional learning for all staff across the entire school, but again, starting small. Just think about the leadership team of your school, just the leadership team. Read the criteria. This is about familiarizing ourselves also with that dusking through dawning, through glimmering criteria. And then make a snap judgment about the quality, quantity, and continued nature of training and development in DEI for that particular group. So have the leadership team had access to quality, plentiful, and continued equity training? And actually, I would further that And I would say, and how successfully have they dripped that, cascaded that down the organization? And so obviously I'm going to give you, you'll have, you take this away with you, take as much time as you want to really engage with those early stages of the criteria. If you feel that you're already at the glimmering phase across all of those areas, with a little that I've provided you with today, then you really should get in touch with us, because we would love to talk about awarding you and you joining our award scheme. And Scotty, thanks for that question. So governors, absolutely, I would include in that as one of the groups, if you're talking about professional learning, as one of the groups that we want to be thinking about. So really, when it comes to professional learning, to what extent do all of our support staff, people who work on our site management team, the people who work in our kitchens and who take such good care of our school environment, to what extent have they had training on equity work? We just can't do equity training or equity work in any way if equity only applies to a few people in the organisation. So this is absolutely about the extent to which everybody is taken care of, and that their needs, their training needs and development needs are met through this work. So I've just introduced you to 5 areas of our 6. Our 6th, which is culture, breaks down into staff, student and parents, and it's a little bit lengthy to go into. And all I've done in those 5 areas is just to give you one little thing that you can go away and do, just keeping it manageable. And so I hope that is useful. Before I leave you this afternoon, I just want to talk a little bit about some success stories that we're seeing. We're really in the early stages, because the first cohort of the DEI maturity evaluation, now known as the Excellence and Equity Awards, they started less than a year ago. So we're still working with them, and it's one of the groups that I most enjoy working with, because we've really focused on building a community of practice. So we are gathering schools around this work who are keen to learn about each other's schools and are keen to share what's working, and keen to get gnarly with it as well, to also share what's not working. And so we have, at the moment, we have around 5 multi-academy trusts in our current cohort. One of those multi-academy trusts, they're all based in the UK, I should say, and one of those multi-academy trusts has all of its deputy heads in the cohort. They are all the ones that are leading on DEI work in the organisation. The second of the trusts is a smaller trust, and they have their heads all engaged in the programme. And they come to as many of the calls as they can. We record all of our sessions, but they come to as many of them as they can. What's really nice is that I know that for these multi-academy trusts, they're meeting outside of the network. So they can meet and talk about work across their school and across their trust. And in another 2 of the 5 trusts, the work is led by one person. So the CEO is leading across one of them, leading this DEI work across all of the schools. And in the other, their DEI lead is leading across the entire group of schools. Both of those are quite challenging, I think. I think the work is really difficult to do if you're the only one doing it and you're trying to sort of audit across the school. So if you're in this webinar and you're thinking, how will I go about auditing across our trust? I would say what's really working in schools that we're working with is to have one lead and to draw those people together to meet every term or every month to talk about what, how the audit process is going with them, and maybe even focus on one pillar of school life at a time. Certainly when we work with schools, we focus on each month. We have a focus, we have a rolling focus, and it changes every month, but we go through policy, digital environment, physical environment, curriculum, professional learning, culture, and back again through. And then in the final trust, the final of the 5, they're taking the approach, they're a very large trust, and they're taking the approach that they're piloting with the more successful schools in the trust, not more successful schools in the trust, they're piloting with those schools that have had most recent success with DEI work. And that is a capacity issue. So they want to see if it's going to work with those schools that are kind of have been ahead of the game for a while and are really are really deep in the midst of the work, and with a view to rolling that out potentially across other schools in the trust beyond the first year. The second group of schools that we have that we've really engaged with are independent international schools. So we've got schools in our current cohort in Saudi Arabia, in the United Arab Emirates, in Thailand, in Malaysia, and in China. And what's been really interesting to witness with them, there was a bit of a reluctance from some of our international colleagues, because I think they felt a bit like, are we going to just get something that tells us all of the things we should be doing in a UK school? And I think what they're finding is that the way that we have built this framework actually talks to all schools. It's not a you must do these things. It is these are the sorts of things that we would see at this level happening across these pillars of school life. And regardless of the kind of school that you run, and regardless of where you are in the world, those pillars of school life remain the same. So the question then is, to what extent are we able to do these given the particular contextual considerations of our school? So we've got some schools who can't focus on certain protected characteristics because it would be illegal for them to do that, but that doesn't mean that they're not able to achieve our awards. And that means that we have really deep and rich discussions about the work that they are doing in relation to those people who hold protected characteristics that they really can amplify and focus on. Some of those schools have started with an element of our framework that I haven't shared with you today, which is around positionality, individual positionality, and then the positionality of our leadership teams. And they are getting great buy-in, for want of a better word. So they've got people in their organizations who have just taken the positionality work, which is to recognize, that DEI is an inside job. See last week's webinar for that, but also to really take responsibility for the way that we shape policy and culture because of the things that we bring to it. And some of those colleagues have been delivering positionality workshops as a consequence of what they've learned in the DEI maturity evaluation, which just warms my heart. But it's been a great way of opening up the conversation about the diversity present in the school among our staff. And then the third group is the largest group, I would say, of primary and secondary schools in the state and independent sector based in the UK. In those schools, I'm mainly seeing the DEI lead coming and leading across this work. And sometimes the DEI lead is also the head, but often it's a single DEI lead. And what's really nice for them is that they're able to lean into our community of practice, because they're not necessarily part of a trust. They're not necessarily working with others in the locality, but they can lean into our community of practice to move forward. I'm more and more of the mind that community is the way that we can do this work really effectively. There's something about sharing our stories and the stories of our schools with each other that both encourages us to be a bit braver, but also reignites us or regalvanizes all of us as educators around the core mission, which is we're here to improve the education sector. We're not just here to improve our own little school and our own little courtyard. So that community of practice is galvanizing, and it's exciting to work in that kind of environment. And I'm seeing these schools be really successful because they show up to the calls and they're holding each other to account. Because they show up, they're holding themselves to account. So there's some success stories. I guess what I can't give you is this school has done this amazing thing in 1 year, because we've purposefully designed this work to take longer than a year, because we think that really good DEI work is going to take much longer than a year. So stick with us, and we hopefully will have some success stories in terms of the awards that we're going to be able to offer to schools over the coming 12 to 18 months. Okay, we're getting towards the end now. I've got some tools for you that I have put into the folder. So you've got the dawning to glimmering narrative criteria there, just a brief summary. Might be useful for you to take that into your schools and to just start having conversations with people. I haven't given you the full criteria because obviously that is part of one of our programs, and I would really like you to join that program if you are interested in deepening this work. I've also shared with you an equity impact framework. It's really not rocket science, but sometimes people find it very helpful to have that tool because it's a framework to help you to evaluate your policies and your procedures through an equity lens. So in the old days, when I first started doing DEI work in schools, I started around 20, nearly 25 years ago now, and equality impact assessments were pretty typical, and they've faded. Their glory faded for some reason, probably because people felt that, well, the narrative is that people felt it was too time consuming and, you know, too much admin. I think in reality, it hides our resistance to equity work. So I love a little bit of admin when it comes to ensuring that somebody's experience of being in my organization is going to be better. Jane, I am just going to share that with you now. I am going to try to share it with you now. There's the folder for anyone that came in a little later. There you go. So the equity impact framework it's just a kind of a series of questions that you can use to help you to review changes that you're planning to make, policies that you already have in your organization. I'm going to say it's a slightly old document, so I put that together a couple of years ago, and I have some changes that I want to make to it because I don't think it's brilliant yet. So watch this space is what I'm trying to say, and we will make some changes, but it's perfectly usable now, which is why I've given it to you as a tool for today. And then the third thing is that you are very welcome to book a 30-minute equity assessment with me. They're free. They are obviously, we hope that they're a gateway to you joining us with the Excellence in Equity Award. I'm going to be completely transparent about that. That is what my dream is, that we have every school in the nation doing this work, you know, really accurately talking about the quality of their equity work. Because I have a picture of a child in my head and it doesn't escape me. And it's a child who is failing to thrive. And it's a child I've written about in this week's newsletter who eats their lunch in the school toilets because they're so scared of the school environment that they're in. And I don't think that an external visitor to that school would ever imagine that that school is dealing with that kind of issue. But we're only as strong as the weakest person in our group. We're only as successful as the child who is failing to thrive in our school. And so I want you to do this work with me. I think we have a really good way of doing it, but I am also really, really excited to just get on a 30-minute call with you and find out about your school and hear about what you're doing. And if you absolutely are, you know, strapped this year, your budget is spent, but you want to kind of push forward, then book an equity assessment with me. There's a QR code there. If you are at the end of this webinar thinking, we really, really want to sign up for the Excellence in Equity Award, formerly known as the DEI Maturity Evaluation, we want to have an audit tool that is going to be rich and meaningful and help us get to the bottom of what's going on in our school. We want to join that community of practice. Then you can sign up today. There is a QR code to our information page, which has just been updated, and you can find out a bit more about the program. But you can also just drop us an email at hello@beingluminary.co.uk. So I hope that this has given you some food for thought. We've got a little bit over time. I hope that you have got some sense of what you want to do next. I hope you've got a little bit of fire for the rest of the week, the rest of the term, some questions that you're going to go and ask your schools. I really appreciate you being here so much. And we are offering, or rather, I say we, royally, meaning me, I am offering a whole bunch of free webinars over the course of this term and over the course of this year of 2025. So stay tuned. I'm going to send you information about those webinars because you've registered for this one anyway, but do keep in touch. Let me know how you get on with this work. Thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to hearing how you get on. Okay, goodbye for now.